All right, and now we take you to the U.S. as the COVID-19 death toll edges closer to 41,000 in the United States, with 765,000 cases. Small protests have sprung up in several states against stringent lockdown or stay-at-home measures. Despite issuing new guidance on measures to reopen economies systematically, President Donald Trump has cheered on protests against social distancing measures in some states run by Democratic governors. At least 20 U.S. states have now seen rallies against what many protesters are calling government overreach amidst tough economic conditions, with more than 22 million jobless claims in the country over the last month. These were some of the views of protesters in Washington state's capital of Olympia yesterday.
I think we do have a sobering guidance, but I think some things are too tough. Now, these are people expressing their views. I see where they are, and I see the way they're working. They seem to be very responsible people to me, but it's, they've been treated a little bit rough.
For more on this story and developments in the United States, we're joined by our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease from New York. Sherwin, thank you as always. Firstly, can you please explain the president's stance for us watching from here? Is he actively supporting these protests or saying what he has said, that somehow the economy has to reopen?
Well, he's sort of treading a very fine line, Francis. In the one instance, you have the federal government under the auspices of President Trump issuing new guidelines that will inform the ability for states to reopen their economies in a very gradual, step-by-step basis. And then you have these protests on the Capitol steps in various states around the country saying that this is complete overreach by the state governors, by the state government, and that they should be allowed to take care of their families and go back to work. And when the president is sort of presented with these protests that go against the guidelines that he days earlier has issued, he tends to side with the protesters, begging the question why you would issue guidelines in terms of social distancing, in terms of telecommuting, in terms of how to reopen the economies. I mean, very strict guidelines, Francis, to inform state governments on how to do this, and then undermine those guidelines by saying, well, some of the restrictions are a bit too rough in certain states. And so, you see frontline health workers on the streets protesting the protesters, because the guidance in terms of health practitioners and the science has been very clear. You need social distancing in the absence of broad-based surveillance and testing. And until we get to that point, you cannot undermine the guidance that has been put in place. In fact, Governor Jay Inslee of the state of Washington, one of the first states to report coronavirus cases at one point, the epicenter in the country, said that the president of the United States is basically encouraging insubordination against the laws that are being put in place to protect people. Anthony Fauci has said that these protests will backfire. If you jump the gun, this could lead to a spike and a further setback. The big fear here is if you're not social distancing, as some of these protesters have been doing, they don't have gloves on, they don't have masks on, they are going to spread this virus, and what they're pushing for is essentially being undermined by the very actions that they're putting forward.
Yeah. While he's walking this line, the president, let's just be clear, he has left the decision to reopen the economy to the governors.
Yeah, and so this is what is so confounding to these very governors. In one instance, you're saying it's going to be your call to reopen them. Here are the guidelines. Apply these guidelines in that process. I mean, essentially what these guidelines are saying is for 2 weeks, Francis, you need to see a steady decline in the number of casualties, the number of deaths, the number of hospitalizations, intubations, the need for ICU beds. There needs to be a 2-week steady decline in that trajectory. And so this mixed messaging about, the fact that people have rights, that people are frustrated, we all understand that. But it's essentially undermining the ability for those very guidelines to reopen the economy to be implemented. So it's a very confounding, confusing communication from various leadership in government here. You need to stay on message in the midst of if you're a wartime president, as the president has spoken about, you need to stay on message through all spheres of government, from the federal to the local, to the municipalities, to the state. Everybody needs to be on the same page, and unfortunately right now that appears not to be happening.
Yeah. So Sherwin, talk to us a bit about the issue of testing and how critical this is going to be in returning countries, not just the US, back to some form of normalcy.
The guidelines are very clear, Francis, in what needs to happen for, in terms of that 2-week trajectory before phase 1, then another 2-week trajectory before phase 2 and phase 3 and so on. And the guidelines speak specifically about the ability to set up efficient screening, testing and surveillance, the ability to quickly supply personal protective equipment if there were to be a spike or a new cluster that emerges once an opening happens. It's going to be critical for medical equipment to be able to quickly be surged when new pockets of an outbreak break out. Let's listen to Andrew Cuomo, the governor of the state of New York, the epicenter of this outbreak, really talking about the need to upscale testing and surveillance if economies are due to open.
Tracing requires an army, literally an army. You would need thousands of people who just trace in the state of New York, right? Because any one person then leads to 10, 20 possible people who were infected. And you have to trace all through those people. You find a positive person, you isolate them. The trick with testing is not that we don't know how to do it. We've done it better in this state than almost any other state, almost any other country. It's bringing this up to scale.
Scale, very, very important there with what the governor is talking about. But Andrew Cuomo has also talked about them launching an antibody testing campaign in New York State. It'll be the biggest antibody testing campaign, really to get an understanding, Francis, of where this virus has been. Remember, we talk about people that are asymptomatic, that don't show any symptoms. And this campaign is going to give them a broader understanding of who has it, who has had it, and who might have built up antibodies in terms of future resistance against COVID-19, Francis.
Has there been any reaction to the news out of China from the UN after Beijing, particularly from the UN after Beijing revised higher that death toll? We know in Wuhan it went up by an incredible 50% or so, Sherwin.
Yeah, it's a specific question we put to the Secretary General spokesperson. We asked specifically, Francis, whether this undermines the United Nations, these revisions, because the Secretary General is on record as talking about the UN and its agencies being as effective as the sum of its parts. And the WHO, as the UN's health agency, would entirely be dependent in those initial stages on the data they received from China. And so it certainly feeds into the negative narrative we are seeing from the GOP, the Republican Party, and the White House in the United States, really questioning the truthfulness, accusing the WHO of being too China-centric. And the UN playing a very sort of middle-of-the-road game here. They don't want to overtly criticize China. They talk about the need for solidarity and unity in arresting the virus right now, but have also said that it's understandable that countries will be revising their figures in the midst of a pandemic of this nature. You know, a lot of moving parts, but also, of course, talking about the fact that there'll be some sort of commission at a later stage to look at the response from the WHO and others in terms of initial response to this virus. So investigations will come later, the UN not wanting to criticize anybody right now.
All right, thank you very much. Our US correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease.